we're going to do the getting set up right and what to do if it ain't. This is basically a setup process we're going to start with accounting, and then we will go a little bit into smart feeder and smart breeder. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time, and we'll just kind of go through it. Okay. We're going to start with the ledger accounts because they are the backbone of your accounting program here. And when we're looking at ledger accounts, this is the first level of division of any of your income, expense, asset, liability, equities. And it's really best to really think this out and how you're going to be using your ledger accounts. You can use alpha and numeric codes. I tend to steer away from the alpha codes, except if you're using like our Eclipse modules, and then it kind of makes sense to use some more of those alpha characters in your numbering system. But you always want to group some like expenses or like ledgers together. Is it income, expense, liabilities, any of it? Such as if you're doing like all your crop expenses, maybe we start with 3,100, and then your livestock would be 3,200 and 3,300 for other like shop expenses. And the reason being is that if you want to run reports, or if you're trying to find those ledger accounts when you're making an entry, it's easier if they're grouped together. Reporting purposes, you can do ranges instead of individual ledger accounts. And as for entry, if they're all there together, not scrolling up and down the list forever. You do want to make sure you leave room for expansion. So maybe 100 lines isn't adequate. I think most times it would be, but for any one certain area, giving yourself space for expansion within your ledger accounts is ideal. I think going back since the beginning of FBS, I think a lot of them started with like 3-digit codes for ledger accounts, and now we're up to, you can go to 5, and I think 6 is a top 6 characters, I think, for your ledger codes now. So we have really expanded the amount of room you can use for ledger numbering system because people were needing that extended chart of accounts. So leave yourself space to expand and for your operation to grow. It's much easier to have that room to add in than having to renumber your whole ledger account system, which I have done. It's not fun. I hope nobody has to do that again, ever. It's just not fun when you renumber everything. You can renumber ledger accounts if it's just not working where it's at in your chart of accounts and you want to renumber it. You always can renumber it. That is not a problem. It keeps historical data even if you change the number. Just so you cannot reuse, like if you already have like a number 100, you couldn't use 100 again until you change that first number 100 to something else, and then you can go reuse it again. You can also, when you set up your ledger accounts, there's a description field. That description field does show on data entry. It also shows on all reports. On data entry, it does get truncated a little bit, but you have that description, and you can change your description at any point in time. It doesn't change anything historically within all your historical data. It stays the same, meaning you don't lose your continuity of your data even if you change the description. Everything will follow along. With all setup files but for ledgers as well, you never delete a ledger account if it's just better to say never. I mean, when you're first setting things up and you've not put any data into FBS, and yes, feel free to delete the ones that may become canned in our chart of accounts. You can delete them. But after that, I never recommend deleting a ledger account. If you absolutely feel you must delete a ledger account, the only way to do it safely is to run a report back to the beginning of time of when you started FBS to make sure that you've never used that ledger account for anything. And if you can say that you've never used it, then you could go ahead and delete it. I just really recommend just inactivating them or inactivating them and changing to a number you're never going to use. They go at the bottom of the list, but they're not completely deleted. And once you delete a ledger account or any setup like a ledger center division, You can go in and run a user-defined report for undefined entries, and it will tell you like ledger account 200 is unknown. That would indicate that you use ledger account 200 for entries and then deleted it and it can't find ledger account 200 anymore. You could come back into your chart of accounts, your ledger account setup, and add back in ledger account 200, and it would find those orphaned entries. But it must be put in exactly how it was the first time it was in FBS. We'll go through the slideshow and then we'll go through the actual program and show you it. It's kind of hard to flip back and forth between PowerPoint and FBS. So I will kind of show you what I mean in all this in a little bit. I do always recommend that you are familiar with the ledger account types and the integration types. When you're setting up, there are fields and there's a help file there, and we'll go through it as well. There's also, I think we do still have the videos up on the website about the ledger account setup if you ever need to refer back to it. But the one thing that seems to be a sticking point with most people, and they just kind of get a little confused, and it's probably our fault at FBS because we use these kind of words, kind of all of them in different situations, and they all mean the same thing, and it gets confusing. But you have integration types, and integrated means linked. And so you might see somebody puts LNK at the end of their ledger account, which indicates it's a linked ledger account. But integrated and linked are the same thing, and they both mean that the ledger account will affect an inventory somewhere in the system. So linked means inventory will be either added to or taken away from it some way. It's going to change the inventory within the system. And this last point would be that it's kind of my caveat with one thing I recommend. I don't know that it's not a hard and fast rule by any means, but what I've found is having fewer ledger accounts and utilizing centers sets the stage for fewer errors on data entry. The more ledger accounts you have, the more to choose from on entry, and it seems like you'll have 4 or 5 that might be similar sounding ledger accounts when you go put it in, and data entry goes to those 5 ledger accounts, and it just gets confusing, and things have to be edited to get them right in the right spots on your balance sheet and income statement. So I just feel that you should have, for your data entry people, the fewer ledger accounts you can have, I think the better, and then you can break that breakdown later with your centers. So for example, you can have a ledger account for you could have a ledger account for shop supplies, cattle supplies, crop supplies, or you could have one ledger account for supplies and assign them to the centers for shop, cattle, crop centers, which you're probably doing anyway. Once you picked, a lot of people who have like shop supplies then assign it to the shop center, which is almost doubling. I mean, it's fine, but you have double the breakdown where you could utilize one ledger account and break down by your centers in your reports. I just think it's easier, and just from my experience, what I recommend. I mentioned centers, and just as well thought out ledgers are important. You want to make your centers well thought out. They make your reports so much more meaningful if you have a good center setup. Centers, I'll call them centers. They're called cost profit centers within the program, and it is as the cost profit center name leads you to believe, the level you want to track your costs and profits. It allows you to group your income and expenses to make informed decisions. Some of the suggested centers you'll see are individual loans would be a center. You would have a ledger account for current and non-current liability, and then you would have a center for each loan, operating loan, your John Deere tractor, your baler, whatever the loan is for, land loans, whatever. There's centers underneath the ledger accounts of either current or non-current liability. We also recommend that you have, if you have the crop audit module, that you have a center for each crop commodity and year. So for like right now, you'd be finishing up corn 21, beans 21, and then you'd start your corn 22, bean 22. You can also break that into your different types. So if you have, high oil corn, or you have seed corn, that would be a center as well. So seed corn 21, 22. Just break it out, whichever makes sense to you. And then within crop audit, you'll obviously have further breakdown to your field. But to start the higher level, we do recommend crop year and commodity. It just helps, especially if you're doing eclipse, you have to have that. You can't have all just like a corn. You need it broke down by commodity year as well. I also recommend overhead centers. So this would be like you have a crop overhead, you have a livestock overhead, you have a shop overhead, just for those expenses that you can't maybe put directly to a specific field or pen of animals or specific building, you would have an overhead center. So that would be like if you bought Roundup to go around all your buildings for the year, that would go in your shop overhead. If you bought gasoline, that will eventually go out to other pieces of equipment, you might put in shop overhead. Or your LP for heating the buildings would go into like a shop overhead, and then break down later on. Just as ledgers, you can edit the center number but never delete them. Same reasons as ledger accounts. If you would ever put any entries to a center and then delete it, that messes your books up going clear back, because it can't find that entry to put in your reports, and your balances never balance back out again until you add that center back. Divisions is the third step we always take with setting up an FBS. And this is to keep some division within your financial records within a single taxable organization. So if, for example, my own operation, we have crops, livestock, and some semis that we do hauling with. So they're all taxable under the same corporation, but we want to be able to see and break out by the crop, livestock, and trucking parts if they're making profit or not. So we do have those three divisions within our FBS setup, just another level to be able to run reports at. Some people do, if you have crops and you have part rented and part owned land, you might separate that to two separate divisions as well. Again, they're taxed the same, your income's the same, all goes in the same tax form, but you might want to be able to split out and see how they're doing separately. And you could do that at a division level. Okay. Are there any questions on the Transaction Plus setup that I went through? Again, we will show it again in live so you can actually see the screen.
I just have one comment, is that many of you have more than one company, and it's good to keep the ledger accounts the same in each company. We make it easy so that if you start a new company, you can just copy those in. But at some point, you might want to run consolidated reports, or join them all under one heading. And also, you don't have to memorize different ones for different companies. So it's good to keep those the same, and maybe general centers the same as well.
Yeah, absolutely is. For there's both, all the reasons you mentioned are probably somewhere we're not thinking of. It's just nice to have continuity between your different companies. So then we go to crop audit setup, and you have your field setup, and then you have your input setup. Fields are pretty static. They don't change a whole lot from year to year. I mean, they can. Obviously, you have a field, you decide to split it and you call it two different fields. That's fine. Okay. But most of the time, oops, I did not mean to go on, but that's, why is my mouse not working?
Participants, two participants.
Where would it show
I don't
me
see
at?
anybody's knocking at the door. Okay, all right.
Okay, sorry. I thought, I don't know if I'll go back or not. I don't know how to go back. So I was saying the fields are pretty static. They don't change from year to year. You put your fields in when you set up. You add new ones as you might acquire them, but they don't change much from year to year. Pretty easy to keep up and keep cleaned up. Your inputs are completely different in crop audit, because as everybody knows, it can be called one chemical called one thing one year and they change the name the next year. You never know what they're going to call it. You could easily change the description on it, where you can put in a new chemical, seed every year there's different seed numbers. You never have the same seed number year to year. So the crop audit is a little more difficult on the input side to keep cleaned up on your setup, but on crop audit setup, it's similar. All of our setup is very similar throughout the product, is that you can edit descriptions, you can edit numbers, you can inactivate them. Again, with crop audit setup, even if you're never going to use that seed variety again, I really don't recommend deleting it, because you might want to go back historically and see how a certain seed variety did. If you have that seed in there, you couldn't. So you just inactivate them and put in new numbers for the new seed varieties. One thing that is a little different, I feel, with chemical inputs is I do recommend alpha characters. And the reason I recommend alpha characters is because there's so many. There's just seems to be so many chemicals in seed. So for me personally, on my seed especially, my Pioneer all start with P. My DeKalb all start with a D. You get that. To be able to find it in the list a little quicker, I do recommend using some alpha characters there. With the chemicals, I've seen a lot of people use like the first 3 or 4 or an abbreviated description of the chemical and then a number following it. So you can start typing in that abbreviated chemical and find it quicker on your input. It's the ultimate goal, obviously, is nobody likes putting in data. So you want it to go in as easy and quickly and efficiently as possible. And having set up that is memorable, so you can remember the numbers, or you can remember, Roundup is R&D something. R&D is all you have to remember, though. It helps a lot on data input, and I really, really recommend that. Fertilizers falls in the same as seed. So you have for your crop setup, you have fields, you have seed, chemical, fertilizer, and operations if you wish. Operations would be stuff like you want to charge out spraying, you want to charge out field cultivating, you want to charge out planting, you would have operations for those and name them such.
Yeah, question on the field setup.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of situations where the field may have been 40 acres 30 years ago, and now it's 600 acres.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any best practices to bring those field names into the system in any way to make them more trackable? Historically, if you've got 2 or 3 fields that were visual, now let's say there's 600 acres, you just call it, whatever section.
Mm-hmm. That is a good question.
Initially, I think you'd have to set up a different field. You might use the same name, but you could put the acres after it.
Set up a different field.
Yeah, because if you ever use that same one and it was 40 acres 5 years ago, when you run a report, well, it's
You
going to,
can't compare.
yeah, you couldn't
Yeah.
do any comparison. So I think you'd have
Yeah.
to say Smith Farm
So
50 or.
when you ran a report, you just tie in the old field names. to
That's
bring in that
correct.
data.
Yeah, that is correct. As you added the new one, you would inactivate the others that added up to that one, the bigger fields, so that you wouldn't put new data in them inadvertently. But then you could always run combined reports on all those fields. Fields are a little different than any chemical or seed or anything like that, and most people don't use. You could use like the FSA number for the field or whatever number it might be. A lot of people use like Smith or the back 40 or by the dairy or whatever it might be. Yeah, right. So fields are kind of funny in the description sometimes when you get people's data sets.
Yeah.
I like reading the field descriptions. They're fun, but they don't change what you're describing. Obviously, they would change usually off the bat. They don't change a lot, but you don't usually. In my experience, people don't have the numbers don't mean as much as the descriptions, I guess, on field setup.
But in the field setup, there is a field for the FSA number,
Yeah.
correct? Mm-hmm. So that if you had to run a chemical report or something, for the FSA, you do
Or
have
insurance.
or insurance, right?
And usually it's not just the FSA. It's what works best is FSA by owner, by tract. It's the 478 acreage summary report from FSA, which most people that don't farmers, they don't even use it. We got to go get a copy of it.
Yeah.
but that is the lowest common denominator that will help insurance, FSA,
Mhm.
Right,
and yourself.
okay.
Okay. And I will show all that live here in a minute within the product. The next setup we would talk about would be smart feeder setup. And these you have a little more setup with smart feeder. You start out with setting up your locations, and then you set up your groups if you have feeding groups. You set up your ingredients, and then you set up your rations and rate of gain tables. Smart feeder has to be a little more step 1, step 2, step 3, where crop audit is you can put your seed in, light, chemical in whenever you want. But smart feeder has more of a steps you have to take within it. So you set up your locations, have those assigned. This location is different from a center. Then you set up your groups based on center and locations. You have ingredients you set up. Ingredients, I do recommend, again, alpha characters using ingredients for the same reason as I recommend alpha characters in crop audit setup, is there's a ton of ingredients. And it's a lot easier to type in salt than trying to remember that salt is number like 1005 or something. So I do recommend for some of those to use some alpha characters to be able to, all your corn ingredients to be CN and then a number, or I see GRCN for ground corn, or soybean meal SBM, obviously, stuff like that. Then you have your death loss causes and treatments, which are both independent, but stuff you have to set up within smart feeder as well. And those are always just numeric on the death loss and treatments. Usually there's no alpha characters. You could, I think, use alpha characters, but usually just numeric characters and all those. Same holds for all of it. Again, I keep reiterating, it's so important. Never delete, always inactivate. Never delete, always inactivate. Please. Please. That's probably the biggest issue when we have people who have been in FBS forever, and your operation changes, and I understand that, and they're like, oh, we haven't used it for 10 years. We'll start using the number again, and then you have no good data when you do that. It's very hard to come back from when you've deleted and reused, stuff like that. Inactivate it, please.
Don't they have a warning now if you try to delete it?
They do. They do. Sometimes pop-ups get ignored. So some do's and don'ts to set up is, do think about how you want to use your data. How are you going to run reports? Have that conversation with Doug or Norm or I about, if we have an idea of what kind of reports you're looking to get out of the program, we can have a lot better path to show you how to set up. If we know what the end result is, wanted, it helps us lead you in the right direction for setup. Do you plan on growth? Your operation is going to change. People are going to come in and out of the operation. Grandparents leave, parents come in, siblings come in, and who knows who's coming in and out of the operation. It grows, it shrinks. There's just change. It's life on the farm change. Do you edit as necessary to improve your data input? I deal a lot with data entry people. They appreciate it if you're looking out for them and their well-being and putting into data. I understand there's tons of stuff you can track within farming, but make it easy on them. Don't make it too difficult on them, because they're going to mess up. Then they're going to be human. There's errors made when you have really a complicated data entry program. So just make it user-friendly. Do not delete anything that has ever been used. Do not delete, do not delete. Some updates that do affect setup files as of version 11.5. For those of you who have been with FBS for a while, it was always really easy to say, I liked my setup from company ABC. I want to copy over my ledgers after you start the company. So I want to copy those ledgers over to my new company. I haven't paid data in. We could do that. We could rename one file and ledgers could come over. Changes have been made as 11.5 that a lot of our setup files are not in individual files anymore. They're all combined into one big file. And we don't have that flexibility we used to have of having ledgers in one file, centers in one file, divisions in one file, ingredients in one file, so on and so forth. They are being merged into one setup file. And if you're newer users and probably won't ever be affected by this, but I just want people to be aware that there are changes in the way we're doing our setup going forward to make the program run as it should. Change is good in this aspect, but we have to be aware of it for those who, mostly the older users who aren't used to that when changes happen, sometimes they're just a little unexpected. So I think we'll see probably more of that, the way the setup files are handled within FBS as we move through the newer build. I think we're through all Transaction Plus rebuild. We're starting on the smart feeder rebuild of it and crop audit slowly, but eventually we're going to be through all the setup rebuilds within FBS. And I expect to see some changes to the way setup is handled within the program. Just be aware it could change as far as the files in the background. Most of the time you won't see that, but it will affect how the program handles the setup files. I think that is my last slide, so we can go to the live product and kind of show in real time what I was talking about. So all of your setup are conveniently under this tab called setup up here in the menu bar. And the cost profit center setup is not in one of the accounting, crops, or feeding breeding options here. It is up here at the top. And this is one of the screens that has probably changed the most in the setup screens in the last couple of years. So if you haven't been in the cost profit center setup lately, it might look different to you. Most of that, all of our buttons used to be at the bottom, and now they're all at the top, but it works the same. Like I mentioned before, we do have our numbers going down here. We number them numerically, and then we have our descriptions. We have these, so we have all like groups, like I mentioned, grouping and ledgers. Grouping and centers is just as beneficial. You have on this one, we have all of our marketing centers together. And then we have like all of our consolidating. These would be like, I call them overhead centers. They're called general centers here in this setup. And then we have some employees, which is always a great idea to have each employee as a center. There are some that are kind of out of order here. They start having some, we have some alpha and numeric characters going on here, which is fine. Within center setup, I do like some alpha characters in here. These are 2-digit numbering systems. I do usually recommend a little bit longer. Some of my preferences when I'm setting up somebody for centers is all my employees will start with EM for employees. All my equipment will start with the EQ. Any kind of loan or liability will start with either LI or LN. And I do prefer to use those alpha characters to kind of divide up and group my centers. When we're talking centers, I didn't want to bring it up in the slide because it gets kind of confusing if you're not looking at it. But I will go ahead and click on the add button here. And the type. We have several types of centers. We have service center, consolidating centers. Those are probably the two most used. And gotta bring up my function button, not working right now. My function button doesn't want to work right now. There is a great built-in help within FBS that will, sorry, I'm gonna pull it up on the side here since my function keys are not working. F1 should bring up the help file. But you can go to transaction setup, and we're talking about center setup right here. I'm gonna pull this up beside us while we're looking at this. So we talked about types. And we have the S, which are service centers, N are consolidating, C are crop, B for breeding, F for feeding, and G for group feeding. And I think we also have M for marketing now. That's not on the help section here, but what this is you can allocate consolidating centers to service centers. Service centers can also be allocated to other centers, but you set up your centers by types, how you want to allocate them out, basically. Anything you want to pool expenses in that later get pushed out to other centers are usually set up for in consolidating center that consolidate your costs in that center. And then they go out to, usually a crop or feeding center. I'm gonna see if I can get both these screens up at once, and it's not gonna let me do both. So you'll see I have all of my general or overhead centers are all consolidating. They're type N consolidating centers. Your employees are usually service centers. Any other kind of general center is usually set as a service center. We do have the marketing centers are set for M marketing. You come down here, any crop center should be set as a crop production center. And your crop marketing centers are set as marketing centers, obviously. You do have, if you're going to be tracking any kind of livestock as a group, it does need set to a group feeding that will, what these different types will do is will trigger different boxes to show up on your entry screens. So when you get past that description line on your entry, a box pops up and has more lines for you to fill out. These center types will dictate, along with the ledger types, what lines show up there to fill out there. So when you're adding these, whatever, what's required to be filled out is at the top here. So you have to have checked active, you have to put a number in and a description in, and you have to have a type. If it is a crop center, so if we change this to a crop production center, our crop boxes down here on the left are now available to be used. So, harvest units, corn, beans, or bushels. Hay could be tons. Wheat would be bushels, obviously. You put your harvest unit in here. The weight per unit is very important, what your ideal weight per unit is for different kind of conversions within the program. So, a bushel of corn is 56 per unit, 56 pounds per unit. A ton of hay, obviously 2,000 pounds per unit. And then your ideal moisture I don't think that figures anything within FBS anymore. It's kind of a reporting function here. And then your crop year is always nice to have, so you can have that just recorded within FBS. It is redundant if you're putting like your description up here would be 2022 corn. I would still put 22 down here. It seems a bit redundant, but I would. If I was adding a new center right now for corn, I would call it, and I will do 4 digits on my year because you're going to be using this product for a while. Hopefully in the year 30 or 30, whatever, you're going to be using it. So you want to make sure you do put the full 4 years in there. And then we've ran into issues where people who've been using it since, 1990, 1980, you want to have all that 4 years in there. You never know when how long you're gonna have the product. So I just recommend 4 years. So I would set this as, my number corn 2022, 22 corn is my description. My type is a production. My harvest unit would be bushel, and this would be 56. And I'm just going to put ideal, I don't know. Commodity. This is just a reporting function for most intents and purposes, but I would go ahead and just pick my 31 corn up here as well. I have my crop year 22. This one is set up for traits. Not many people use these traits, but you can just know that there is a setup for traits, and then you can pick if it was like a Liberty Link or, you know, BT, anything like that. And you've added your center. It will show up alphanumerically wherever it falls. This is a weird set, so I'm really not sure where it's going to show up at. Looks like it's going to be right here, my cord 22. And then you always have to save. It will tell you if you try to leave here, it will say, hey, you want to save your changes, and you want to hit save. It saves it to the database. One thing is set up that you can have multiple people in FBS at a time with your network licenses, but you can only have one person in a setup file at a time. It will warn you if somebody else is in this file if you try to save it. It will only, if the file is opened by 2 different people, it will only save the last one that was closed. So if I was in it and Cheryl was in it, I made a change, and Cheryl still had to open it and she made her change would save, mine would not. So it will warn you, though. Don't be too scared about it. I've never had many problems with it, but there is limitations to the setup. All of the setup works the same. I'm opening this ledger account one, but it looks almost identical to the center setup. The only difference you really see here is you see a couple more columns. We have our classes on the left, and these are just broke down by the 5 classes. 1 is income, 2 is expense, 3 is liability. No, 3 is asset, 4 is liability, and 5 is equity. You don't have to remember that. It just is what it is. That's how they're listed. Within those classes, they are then listed in alphanumeric order. And you have your description. A is active, your type. There are different types, just like there are different types in your center setup. Notice the buttons are at the bottom here. This file has not been totally converted over yet. So the buttons are still at the bottom. For the types, we have A as standard, which is one you'll use for almost all of your general ledger accounts. And B is money borrowed, so that would be any kind of liability. It does not, because when you use a liability account and mark it as B, it will ask you for your interest rate and your the final due date of maturation date, I guess is probably a better word, of the loan or money borrowed. It will not automatically calculate any kind of payments or anything like that for you, but it will record that for you. C is livestock sales. It will ask for pounds and head and stuff like that if you use that option. Capital livestock, capital purchases, hired labor. That will just give you, if you're not importing in from a different a payroll software where it breaks down by ledger account on your your taxes, your payroll taxes, it will give you a box to put in. You figure your FICA, withholding, all your withholdings, and put them in the different boxes, and it will track that, but not to different ledger accounts if you use that G. It just like a recording function. Crop purchases and sales is type J. You obviously use it for crop sales and purchase accounts. It will ask for bushels or units that were sold or purchased. Unit price will give you an extra column where it will break down. If you say you bought 500 bales of hay for $500, it will break down the unit price of $1 each for you. It will do that calculation for you, or it will reverse calculate as well. If you bought 500 bales and you paid $500 each, it would calculate the $500 in the amount column for you. I don't know many people use the L hedging account, but that is an option. The last 2 are absolutely essential for running Transaction Plus. You cannot make a check or deposit entry without at least one account marked as a bank account. So you have to list any kind of bank accounts as type M bank account. And then for FBS, to keep you having a balanced balance sheet, you must have one net income account. that is where your net income is your retained earnings and net income flows through and calculates within the program.
Just a word on class. Never change the class once you've been using them. I forget the reasoning, but I have had a person change something from an asset to a liability or whatever.
It messes up whereas it shows on the balance sheet, I think, if you
Oh,
do that. It just is not good. We talked about how you could change numbers. I'll just quickly show you. So if I had this soybean sales was 300 and I wanted to change it to, I want to start going, 4 digits instead of 3 digits. I could change it to 3,000 and click OK. And it changed it. If I already would have had account 3,000, it would not have let me change it. It would have told me it was already in use, but it let me change it. But the way it lets you keep it, your historical data, is we have this account 3,000 down here now. The internal ID stayed at 300. So this is the internal ID that you cannot change. FBS assigns it and is in charge of this number. Nobody else can change it. But it keeps the historical data going, keeps it together. So any entries I made to account 300, if I ran a report on account 3,000, all my entries from 300 would show up in that account, or in that report, excuse me. I would not lose that historical data and continuity there.
Is that the same way, like with your enterprises, like your equipment? Do you change the name of your equipment with your full historic data in the reports?
Yes, anything that had that number.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't go by the description when you're running a report, it goes by the number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll show divisions, but the screen looks a little different, but it's just your divisions acts exactly the same. Add, change, delete, never delete, but it's there. You cannot, the only difference with divisions I will say is you cannot activate and inactivate them. If they're on the list, they're active. That's it. There's no inactive button on a division. But divisions are where you can have different fiscal years. I don't recommend it. I don't know if it's a single taxable entity, they should all have the same fiscal year. But if your company changed fiscal years, you could change it I recommend doing it for all divisions you have set up, but you could change your fiscal year here on this screen. And what that changes I think the only thing it really affects within FBS is when you click on that calculate retained earnings, it calculates that retained earnings based on that fiscal year, first day of the fiscal year you have set up for your divisions. We'll go down here to crops. And we'll just put chemicals. We'll just put chemicals, but just know they all work the same. Obviously, the headings are going to pertain to the setup item you have, but for the most part, they all work the same. You can see here we have some numeric 2 and 1, 101. We have Excel. We have some letters over here, AMS, stuff like that. So it's kind of whatever works for you. I do prefer on my chemicals, especially. I do like to have some alpha and numerics. Now, obviously, we have Acceleron, we have Ascent. You couldn't start both. I mean, you could start with both ACC, but it might be a little confusing. So just kind of think that out, how you want to do that. If you want to use some letters and numbers there, or how you're going to handle that, what works best for you.
One other thing, if the same chemical comes in different size packaging,
Yes.
like Roundup, you need to have a separate setup for each one.
Same with seed. If you get in a bag or a tote or a mini bulk, you better have 2, 3, whatever you need seed setups for that. Because they all do have purchase units, application units. AU is application units and purchase unit, I should say. And this will all calculate within the program based on specifically applications and units and purchase units is a big hang up with all of our crop setup, because if you're importing it in from wherever, whatever monitor, whatever system you're importing your applications in from, they better match what you have set up here in FBS, because otherwise it will not come over correctly. Your conversions have to be the same between FBS and whatever you're importing in from, just to make sure that you get the right quantities applied to your fields. It does ask, and so it's that you can see we have a purchase unit for this we have the Atrix. We purchase it in gallons. Then there's 4 application units and a purchase unit, so that application units are quarts. So you do label both. You label what you purchase it in, what you apply it in, and then your conversion number in there. Same with seed. You buy a bag. Purchase it in bags. You apply it in kernels. How many kernels is in a bag? It would be your application unit. But that is probably the biggest issue I see with any kind of setup. Usually it's pretty straightforward, but if there's a problem with crop setup, it's in this application unit column somewhere. This inventory will show if you are doing your purchases and applications in the FBS. A number will usually show in this application column. I recently found out somebody was actually using that as a report to report how much they had on hand. Do not recommend that at all in any of these setup screens. It does show it there, but know that that isn't going through and calculating everything. So it could be incorrect or inaccurate. I recommend just running a regular report to find out what your current level of inventory is of each setup or each input. I'm sorry. But it does show it here. You can list your EPA number here, your budget price. Some people always ask what the budget price is, and in the setup screens, and that is you put in a price you're expecting you're going to buy it for, or you bought all your chemical for the year and your average price you could put in there. There are reports that will report on budget price. But the biggest thing is if you are, you bought all your chemical, it's in here, you applied it, but your applications aren't right and you go negative in inventory, it's going to pull that budget price in to value that chemical after you go negative. So some people prefer to leave these at 0 so they can see when that goes negative easier and they can see the mistake quicker. I almost tend to prefer to update my budget price and put my average price in here, so that even if I don't catch that mistake right away, I'm somewhat covered on my actual value of my chemical applications, because I have that average value of price of that chemical in there instead of 0. It's whatever you prefer. I can see the benefit of error catching with putting it at 0, but that does affect your application price if you go negative.
And I want to give an example of that. Say you've purchased your chemical and they delivered it, but if you're doing things strictly on a cash basis, so you've got delivery and you've applied it before you've even paid for it, and then you run the report, but you're not including the date that you paid for it, then that's all negative because it doesn't know that you've paid for it. Now, if you're using accounts payable, you book that cost when you get it, receive it. So that works, but another reason to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. This time it's a typo, but it can be that too. I think you forget we're human. Typos happen. They do happen. All your crop setup is going to be the same. I think it's a little redundant to kind of show that. So we're going to go on down. Feeding and breeding are very similar. We have more feeding customers, so I will go to the feeding here. A little bigger here. I can't read. Hopefully you guys, I can't read that far away. Hopefully you guys can. I apologize. These work just like your chemicals, except that you don't have the EPA numbers. Basically, you have a conversion still, feeding ingredients also. You have to be very careful. It's conversion factor. It is called conversion factor here instead. And you do only have the purchase unit here, so sometimes it gets a little confusing. But you do have, so if you purchase it in pounds and feed it in pounds, your conversion is 1. Corn, you can see here, they have that they purchase it in bushels. So you obviously feed corn in pounds and not in bushels. So you do have, your purchase unit says bushels, and then your conversion factor is set to 56, because there's 56 pounds in a bushel of corn. Bags would be another one. If you're doing kind of complete feed or bagged feed, you purchase it in bags and you feed it in pounds. So that can, it's mostly usually 50-pound conversion, but I've seen a lot of 40 and 45-pound bagged feed as well. Or you might buy it in tons, and then your conversion factor would be 2,000, because there's obviously 2,000 tons or pounds in a ton. So your conversion factor is a very big thing here. The other only different kind of setup here is that you do have your class. So you set these classes up how you want to do them. Mostly you would have, I usually see protein premix, complete, and medications, and maybe minerals. There's a couple other here, which is fine. So like, if you want to, you could do reports by your classes. You can run different reports by class. So if that's important to you, then you want to set these up. I don't know that many people do a lot of reporting by class, but it is obviously an option here. The setup also does allow you to put in your percent protein, lysine, and your mCals energy per pound. Put that in there. I don't think there's many reports that will utilize that data, but you can definitely put it in there just to help you out and for reporting, some reporting and recording purposes. Okay. That's been about an hour. I don't want to overwhelm you. There is a lot more setup as you build off this basic setup. I did the basic setup. There's more. There's report setup. There's report definition setup. There's importing setup. There's just so many other setups that you build on as you move through setting up FBS. Some other ones would be your overhead allocation tables, your check setup, you're putting out your checks. I mean, I couldn't cover it all in an hour. I wanted to get the basics of how you get going. Usually that would be if I'm training somebody new, this would be my first 2, depending on their operation, if it's crops or livestock, my first 2 training sessions with somebody new. We build on the actual backbone, get entries being put in, and then we move to report setups or overhead allocation setups. So I didn't want to get into other setup options. When you're doing setup, don't stress. I mean, think about it, but don't stress about it, because things can be changed at any point in time. You can't break anything in FBS. There's some way to fix it. There's no way to completely break it, I promise. Been there, done that. Me and Cheryl, one of us has handled it. We know how to fix it. So think about it, but don't stress about it. Okay.